All right, so right now we have a couple of blocks that are reserved for specific purposes. We have a set of blocks that are reserved for V6 transition, and we have another set that is reserved for critical infrastructure. The current text of Section 8, our transfer policy, does not distinguish whether or not this applies to all address space. It doesn't prevent these reserved blocks from being transferred to a third party that doesn't satisfy the original requirements that were placed on the original recipient of this space. So there are a couple of issues here. First, the space was reserved for a specific purpose and is able to move to another party that doesn't fulfill those original requirements. Also, specifically with the 4.10 space, the address ranges that are reserved for V6 transition, transferring this space out of the region could complicate the single aggregate from which we're asking providers to let in announcements of smaller than a /24. So this is a pretty simple policy proposal here. We would be adding to sections 8.3 and 8.4 text that would prevent these address ranges from being transferred. One thing to note here is that this wouldn't affect Section 8.2 transfers, M&A transfers. You could still transfer this reserved space as a part of an M&A transaction. So we would just be adding text to the bottom of 8.3 and 8.4 that says address resources from a reserved pool, including those designated in sections 4.4 and 4.10, are not eligible for transfer. And the same thing would be added to section 8.4. So we want to hear some feedback from the community. What do you guys think? Should we support preventing the transfer of reserved pool address space via 8.3 and 8.4 transfers?
Thank you. Keep that in case we need to drive. Thank you, Amy. And here on our last draft policy of the meeting, microphones are open. As everyone kind of says, lunch tastes good, but policy is better.
Scott Librand, ARIN-AC. I would like to bring up for discussion of the group a modification that was proposed on PPML by Gary Burmester and some revised text that I generated from that. Specifically that we, instead of disallowing transfers from these reserve pools entirely, we require that the recipient of any transfer from the reserve pools also meet the requirements of getting space under the reserve pool. So the text would just add that those recipients must qualify for those resources under the policy criteria for that reserve pool. I personally believe that that would be a better structure because it is possible that there are organizations which may be restructuring or otherwise changing in such a way that they want to use Section 8.3 or possibly 8.4 to transfer addresses that they control that happen to be under these. And currently, Section 8.3 is a very effective way to get addresses from one organization to another, even when it doesn't exactly qualify under 8.2 M&A. This would disallow that for these blocks if the recipient organization intends to use them in the same way that the source organization was using them. I believe it would be more appropriate to allow that transfer, but simply to require that the addresses continue to be used for the purposes of the reserve pool from which they're drawn. So I would like to put in a plug for that, but also more importantly, to get feedback from the community in this room as to whether that would be an improvement on this policy or not. We haven't heard anything really on PPML for or against that, so I'd like to hear more feedback.
Don't run away. When you're at the mic, you don't get to run away that quickly because Amy would like to ask a follow-up, and then I have a question for you.
Thank you for your question. Would you want that to apply just to 8.3 transfers within the ARIN region, or are you suggesting that also apply for 8.4s?
I can't think of a good way to make that work for 8.4, so I'd be fine with it only applying to 8.3.
Keep trying to run away from me. But even without that change, would you be supportive of this policy?
I am undecided at this point, but leaning towards supporting it.
Thank you. Front microphone again.
Owen DeLong, Akamai, ARIN-2016-1. I support the policy as written.
Bless you.
I could live with the change that Scott's proposing, or that Gary proposed and Scott is expressing, with some limitations or modifications to it. Basically, there's three categories of utilization of the reserved pool space that come into play. DNS operations for root and GTLD zones, and primarily traditional GTLD zones, not the new I Can Make Money Fast project. And the deployment of exchange points being the second category. The third category being the 4.10s, the transition space for V6. I can't imagine a scenario in which an 8.2 transfer would not suffice, but we would still want to allow the transfer under that category. So I'm kind of disinclined towards supporting that. And then in the case of the exchange point, you're either continuing the same exchange point operation, in which case 8.2 makes perfect sense, or you're not, in which case I'm not sure we want to allow the transfer. And the same would apply to the DNS operators. So I'm not sure I really see the need for allowing transfers on this stuff, even in those limited circumstances. I'd much rather see if the original need for the space no longer applied, the space should go back to ARIN. I think this is one of those few cases where we've got a clear-cut case of relatively binary, either you still need the space for the original purpose or you don't, and if you don't, you should return it to ARIN. It's not a matter of incentivizing you to renumber into something else or anything else like that that the current 8.3 and 8.4 transfers are intended to enable. So I don't think those apply. I think we're fine without transfers, but I could live with a very limited set of transfer permissions if that was necessary to get the policy passed. Personally, I prefer it as is.
Thank you.
Do I get to run away now?
You may, you're, unless you want to bring your chair back out into the aisle. Kevin Bloomberg was, no, sorry, is this point of, John Kern first.
Briefly, just an informational point. We reviewed all 8.3 and 8.4 transfers done to date. Nothing from these reserve pools have yet been transferred via an 8.3 or 8.4 transfer.
Thank you, very useful information. Kevin Bloomberg and then Vint.
Kevin Bloomberg, The Wire, ARIN-AC, and the author of this proposal. This proposal came out of staff discussion or clarification a couple months ago. When I proposed this, I looked at the idea of allowing transfers and specifically excluded them. I'd originally only included 4.10 because that was critical that it stay as a single aggregate, but felt that the reason for removing or not having transfers was the community set up the reserved pool to the detriment of the general population of the ARIN community. They did it because of the overall overarching benefit to the community to have reserved pools for extremely specific cases. My concern with any transfer language in this is we are setting ourselves up for people coming and looking for ways to use the reserved pool while following the letter of the policy, not necessarily following the spirit of the policy, and then looking at 12 months later affecting an 8.3 transfer or whatever the case may be. If you need it, you should be getting it from the reserved pool. If there is a problem with the reserved pool, where we start running down on the reserved pool 5 or 10 years from now, which is when we recently looked at it, the projections, I think we can revisit it then. But to open the gates before there's even a problem with transfers, I think, like I said, sets a precedent and creates a situation that we will not be able to reverse from. So I'd prefer not seeing it anywhere in the beginning.
Okay, Vint next.
It's Vince Cerf, Google. So this is a question for Kevin. The scenario that I wanted to try on you is the positive case where the transfer is proposed and the receiving party intends to use those addresses for the purpose for which they were assigned to the reserve pool. One scenario is it's returned by the transferring party to ARIN, and then it is reassigned to the recipient party on the grounds that those are needed and they can justify it. I was trying to figure out whether there was a case that you might worry about where the transfer takes place with the exception of these particular things, and somehow or other it's not possible to provide those addresses to the recipient party, even if they're needed. But I guess you could make the argument if they go back to ARIN, the question is could they be snatched by someone else, and then the receiving party who intended to use those for the correct purposes can't get them. Is that a scenario that we should worry about?
So in both pools, we have thousands. In the 4.10, we have potentially thousands upon thousands of available addresses that a party can come directly to ARIN and does not have to deal with the transfer market. In the case of the critical infrastructure pool, can staff just clarify, I believe there's been, what, 6 critical infrastructure or 8 critical infrastructure assignments in the past year? Somewhere under 10. That's a very small number. Based on that, we have 10 to 15 years worth before transfers even becomes an issue.
Thank you. Front microphone, then remote participant. Sorry, Vint, you did it? No, we're going to go front microphone, then remote participant.
Andrew Dahl, ARIN-AC, the secondary shepherd on this policy, but I'm speaking as a community member on this at the moment. I think we don't necessarily do ourselves a service by creating second classes of addresses that are now non-transferable. We have gone down the road where these 4 addresses are transferable, and now making a U-turn and putting some in a box strands them and doesn't keep them from actually being used in a way that possibly could be useful. I see very little downside personally to allowing these transfers to occur if they actually do occur. They haven't to date. I suspect they might in the future. I don't actually think that that would be a bad thing.
Thank you. Remote participant. Whoa, what's going on here? Yes, Scott.
Scott Librand. Follow-up question for Andrew. Are you referring to opposition to the proposal as written and wanting to allow transfers of reserve pool space to people, to just anyone, or are you talking about my suggestion of allowing it to other people who qualify for the conditions of the reserve pool?
I don't think we should be putting more restrictions on transfers, so I am opposed, I guess, to both of those criteria as they are currently expounded on.
Thank you. Remote participant, John Springer.
This is Kristen BLecker, the Walt Disney Company. I support the policy as written. I would be okay with Gary/Scott's amendment for 8.3 transfers, as it requires the same reserve requirements be met. I agree with Owen in that I don't see many cases where this would happen, but I don't think it would be that harmful if the same reserve pool needs are met.
Thank you. So we don't. Yes, I was going to say, weren't you just there? But before we do that, the microphones are going to close in a minute. We seem to, unless we see people. So if you'd like to speak, could you please approach a microphone? Rear microphone, please.
Jason Schiller, Google, ASOAC. I think it would be a travesty if addresses that are reserved for specific uses, because those are so very important, such as core DNS servers or critical infrastructure or V6 transition, be allowed to be transferred and used for business as usual. I think that would be terrible. I think that we should address that. I'm not sure whether I like the as-written proposal better or Gary's amendment better. And part of me is debating on whether or not we could combine the two and make it such that transfers from the reserve pools are not permitted until the specific pool is empty, at which time transfers are permitted, but only such that the recipient meets the requirements of the pool.
Okay. Vint, did you want to address that, or?
Only to ask, sorry, Jason. If what you just said were taken literally, does that mean that some of the reserved addresses would just stick somewhere and not get used at all for their purpose, and it would accumulate a collection of unused addresses? It'd be better if they ended up back in the pool or got transferred to someone who was going to use them for the same purpose. So I think if I've misunderstood what you said, you should correct me, but it sounded like you didn't want to do the transfer, but then you just left them stranded at the source, which was prepared to transfer them but wasn't allowed to do so under your rules. So can you help me with that?
Yeah, so the thought is that the source would return them to ARIN. ARIN would reclaim them, they would sit in that reserved pool, and anyone who needed space out of it could get them back out. But I think you do point out a very good point, which is, does such a policy incentivize people that are holding this reserve space to not return it and to wait for that pool to deplete so that they could transfer and monetize it? And I think you're right in pointing that out. That probably is a problem. So I think we should probably either not allow transfers or allow transfers from day one. I withdraw.
Jason, don't, Amy would like to ask you a question. Oh, all right. The question was resolved in the closing moments of your comment there, so thank you. Anything, John Springer, just checking in? Excellent. Front microphone, please.
Gary Campbell, Jamaica, Government of Jamaica. A quick question. If support were to be given to that policy position, would any provisions be made for exceptions, in the sense that would it be a case where everybody would be subject to the same terms and conditions, or would it make some special provisions for maybe special cases?
John's going to address that.
So, unfortunately, the way the policy manual is written, we actually have to follow it pretty much verbatim. There's a few areas where the community has specifically given us leeway, but with respect right now, presently these transfers would be allowed. If someone showed up with transferring this special space, we would be remarkably flexible because we're not prohibited from doing so. If this policy is adopted, because it would, as written, it would say we cannot do it, there would not be exceptions. We would be prohibited from doing so.
All right, we've got a question here from staff, from Amy. For staff, sorry, from Amy. Thank you. Thank you for keeping me correct. And after that, we are going to close the queue. So now is your last chance. Go ahead, Amy.
So my question for staff is, how often are we seeing people return reserved pool space freely on their own? Is this something that's happening on a regular basis or ever?
You want to get a minute or two?
To my knowledge, it hasn't occurred. Give me a minute, please.
We will check on that. So while we check on that, let's go to the remote participant, and the microphones are now closed.
Sandra Murphy, Parsons. I support this policy, especially with Gary/Scott's amendment. The reserve pool was instituted to meet a particular need. Allowing transfer would permit elimination of the address's availability to meet that need. When the general pool is depleted, this could be readdressed.
Thank you.
Owen DeLong, Akamai, ARIN-AC. I don't see any need for exceptions. And in terms of allowing transfers when the pool is depleted, we've got lots of time to decide that we want to start allowing transfers within this space when the pool is depleted, well before the pool gets depleted. We've got many, many, many policy cycles. If history has taught us anything, it's that looking that far ahead, we are blind. And so I would not advocate taking an action now to deal with something that'll happen so far in the future, because we almost invariably get it wrong. And why take another opportunity to get it wrong when we can wait until we have a higher chance of getting it right?
Still in favor,
Still in
partial
favor
to the,
as written.
Yeah, thank you. Double check, see if John might have had his answer yet.
A quick check says we're unaware of any circumstances where reserve space has been assigned. We will confirm this, but the answer appears to be it hasn't.
Okay, thank you. Final comment at the rear?
Hi, Aaron Hughes, 6 Connect, Aaron Board. Just want to remind of one particular use case, which is for the V6 transition purpose. If a new organization starts a V6 only infrastructure in the Aaron region and needs unique identifiers for loopbacks and protocols, and that company gets acquired by another region, they're not going to renumber those interfaces. That would be a significant cost to the organization and may break the deal for an acquisition.
Okay, thank you for that. So, did you have it in your mind before or after I closed the queue?
No, it's a direct response to
All right, okay.
Aaron, 8.2 mergers and acquisitions are excluded, so if an organization was in that situation, that is allowed. This is only transfers for in 8.3 or 4.
Okay. All right, with that, we'll close the discussion. Let's thank Amy for the presentation assistance. We will now move to our poll. So and this is the last poll, so let's try and get heavy audience participation. The pollsters are ready. So the question today on the matter of 2016-1 shall be, are you in favor of the Advisory Council continuing to work on this proposal? Those that are in favor, please raise your hands nice and high. Come on. Come on, raise them high, not have to raise them. Sorry. Thank you. You may lower your hand, so that finishes that slide for today. And those who are opposed, please raise your hand nice and high. Thank you. Those who raised, if they were, are done. One moment for the results. Thank you again for your participation in the policy processes for this meeting. Always lively. And I'll just use the silence to say I'd just like to thank ARIN staff for that wonderful social last night. Did everyone not have a good time? Let's just give me a hand for that. Thank you, sir. On the matter of 2016-1, Reserve Pool Transfer Policy, we have 86 people in the room, 4 remotes. That's a total of 90. In favor, 28. Against, love, or nil. So this will be provided to the Advisory Council. Back to John. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Question from remote.
Okay, we're getting back on track. We're going to pick up with the global reports, the one we didn't get to.
Question from remote.
Yep, go ahead.
Sandra Murphy, Parsons. John Kern sounded like he said, quote, not aware of any circumstances when reserved space has been tick assigned, close tick, period. Really? Transcript is not cut up. Think either I misheard or he meant return.
Sorry. That's my high-speed Boston speaking combined with the valiant efforts of someone to keep up doing the transcript. Let's try it better. Staff has looked, to our knowledge, we are not aware of any of the reserved space being returned.